Check two. So just confirm. Here it is. Check two.
Yeah, is that on? That is on. Cool. So before we talk about men, and maybe to some men and to some women about the topic, just wanted to say some words of welcome. Thrilled on behalf of Promundo, as well as our partners at Vanderbilt University. Thanks to APA for this, Partnership for Male Youth, Prevention Institute, and I knew tell me who I'm forgetting, Alexa. That's it, right? That's our partners? Yeah, got that? Yes, I am prepared. We are prepared. Before we talk about men, we thought it was interesting to listen to some men, and we're thrilled that producer of Man Enough is here, and we're going to look at a few minutes of this just to try to get us having a conversation before we kind of do the more formal presentation part of stuff. So let's show this. Let's show this. Do I have to do something? No, there we go. Thank you.
Right? I don't want to be 100%, but I'm going to say there's very, very few men, if any, that get a pass on not contributing to the problem. You know, and we might not be doing the things that would be deemed as illegal, right? Rape, assault, etc., right? But the truth of the matter is, men who do those things, they don't do it without the permission of the rest of us, right? We create the collective socialization of manhood.
You nailed it. Yep. Good men are a part of this. People who are good people are a part of this. In every conflict, you have a perpetrator, a bystander, and a victim. And what people need to learn is the bystander plays the greatest role in any conflict. A bystander can change a conflict. A perpetrator, when a victim says, please help me, the perpetrator goes harder. We're the bystander within our group, and we have the greatest responsibility. So if I have power, I want to use it for that.
Well, if you look at society, right, we are defined as good men, as well-meaning men, as righteous men, and we can wear that tag, that label, that title, and not be invested in the well-meaning of other people. Yeah. As long as we individually are not hurting anyone,
that's right,
right? We are well-meaning men, good men, and we can stand by and watch atrocities happen to other people and not intervene, not teach others not to. We cannot challenge that behavior and not lose any of our status, right? You're still a good guy. You're still a well-meaning guy. You know, I don't know. We live in a country that's built around individualism, you know? It's kind of fluid throughout our Constitution about you and your individual rights as a person. And that's carved out this thinking for us as Americans. Take care of me and mine. And whatever's going on with everyone else, I have no responsibility unless I want to. So I can watch terrible things happen to people. And I can stay right here in this spot. And I'm going to still sleep good at night. And everybody is going to still see me as a wonderful guy, you know?
We'll hear more from Farouk later on about how this program has been used. But we just wanted to start it off with a kind of making the space welcoming to be able to talk about men and masculinities. And we're thrilled that APA agreed and hosted us here because APA Division 51 did the very brave and necessary piece last year of coming out with some important guidelines on why these ideas about masculinities matter for the mental health of young men. My name is Gary Barker. I'm the founder and CEO of Promundo. Thrilled that we could co-host this with you. It's been we won't tell you how rapidly we put this together, but it was a really fun moment of, we asked kind of everybody that we thought, oh, so-and-so should be here, and everybody said yes. So really thankful to Wisdom and Derek and all the rest who agreed to be part of this conversation. David and Michael, who you'll hear from later on, who are part of Promundo's board and thought leaders in the space as well, kind of everybody said yes. And we really wanted to give as well, you know, the symbolism of being an APA and acknowledging the heat that you all took for daring to question ideas about manhood as part of a profession of psychologists working to make life better. So that's where I'm going to start, of thinking about where are we in this conversation? Why is this turned into such fighting words to talk about where are we to think about young men? Is that working? Yeah. I stand that way? There we go. I also want to acknowledge one of the sponsors of this event as well, which is the brand Axe, the young men's deodorant spray. Unfortunately, nobody from Axe or Unilever could join us on the panel. They've supported us in some research around making noise of this thing that many of us are calling either the man box or restrictive ideas about masculinities or masculine norms. They've supported us in doing a study that we think coincides a lot with the APA ideas of how to make visible, how to make real, how to make understood, and how to create approaches that say if these norms matter, what do we use them to put into our practice as educators, as psychologists, as health professionals, as activists in this space. And I want to acknowledge the number of, sorry, that slide went faster than I wanted to. Does that go backwards? Am I allowed to move that? There we go. Sorry, I was not ready to move there. Before we move ahead, I want to acknowledge the results that I'm presenting are from several Promundo colleagues. A couple of them are here. Cody, who is here, I'll ask him to raise his hand later on. That is not to blame them for any mistakes that I might make in presenting. It is to acknowledge their authorship of it. Cody, there's Cody right in the front. All right, Cody, thanks for many other staff and Brian Haleman being the the lead co-author of some of these findings, is based in Minnesota. Couldn't be here today, but I did want to acknowledge that. Before we step into what we're finding in some of these results in a new analysis that we've done of the Man Box study, I think it's important to say, why are we here as individuals? And we saw a piece of the Man Enough film to talk about, we're not talking about manhood in the abstract, we're all in it. We're making it, we're reconstructing it, we're building it. My story, part of it starts with this, and I'll read this to you. It has taken me a long time to be able to put it in one paragraph and read it out loud. 16-year-old boy was being held in county juvenile detention home today in connection with the fatal shooting of a high school classmate. Perry Raymond, 17, and Alif Hastings, high school junior, shot and killed Tuesday in the cafeteria of the adjoining high school. Harris County Sheriff's deputy said the boy was shot 3 times in the chest and abdomen with a .44 caliber in the lunchroom of Alif Elsik High School as more than 100 students and teachers looked on. That is about 40 years ago. It is embarrassing, it is outrageous how little we have moved on these issues. There were many, as somebody who knows, and I'll tell you where my part of this story, it is another story of a tragedy in a young man's life foretold. Lack of mental health services at all in the school. In fact, no health services embedded in either of these high schools. Bullying, behavioral issues that were treated with the classic remedial education, let's send the bad boys to a separate space. Home problems that I happen to know about of at least one of the young men involved, with the lack of all kinds of social or public health or any other services, limited services for low-income families. This in a state that preferred to give tax rebates to oil companies than to actually invest enough money in public schools. Rapidly growing suburb that couldn't get enough teachers in the classroom to even do their jobs well. 40 years ago, I don't know if we could name, I don't know how many school districts in the US we would say that set of characteristics came to play and still exist. I'm not at all minimizing all the things that happen to young women in similar kinds of settings, but in this particular incident, it is very clearly, as it has been in 99% of the cases of high school shooters or shooters in schools, they have been young men, occasionally adult men, but always about men, among other things. Don't get me started on the gun access issue. I was one of those 100 students in the cafeteria that day. It was actually more than that, but it's very difficult to even find much information about it now because things were kept in microfiche and microfilm, if anybody remembers those old record-keeping stuff, so you can barely find information on this particular incident. It was a lot of years to be able that other students and myself who were there could talk about it. Our school sent us back to class. An announcement that came over later, back to class. It involved students from the other. I knew the 2 individuals from middle school age. I probably felt one of them's fist in some part of my body along the way. You could feel the challenges that both of those young men were going through years before and the lack of appropriate attention to it. The other part that called me to think about masculinity is long before I even could have said that word was that kind of invisible wall that many of us felt as the incident was happening around us, as girls cried and sought solace, and boys stood there in the ways that we feel this invisible force telling us, don't show that you're sad, don't show that you're, the deep amount of sorrow, fright that you're feeling in this moment. Ask about the caliber of the gun. Ask about how many shots were fired. Look at your shoes. Talk about anything but what just happened to us and the fear and the sadness that we felt at this tragedy that unfolded before us. And I'm thankful to folks at APA and professionals who have given words to this, that years later I had the fortune of reading about them, whether we've called these the boy code, whether we've called these masculinities, masculine norms, and we have found the expression the man box invented by Paul Kivel to be a particularly useful one. It resonates as a metaphor, and it seems to cause less fighting than when we say toxic masculinity, that lots of men read kind of as if there's a subtitle that says, you hate all men. And I think the man box has tried to say, how can we understand our part in it? How can we understand it as a force that we need to think about breaking out of for the good of all of us? So share some results. Many of you know the study that we did a couple of years back that we called the Man Box based on that name. and found just how alive and well, in spite of these years of amazing work around promoting gender equality, women's empowerment, changing definitions of gender, how much our sons, there we go, how much our sons are still stuck. 72% of young men across the 3 countries telling us they're still told there's some real way to be men. We then developed a number of questions based on that. The scale holds together. Those of you who are scale nerds, it holds together well. We can talk about its psychometric properties. It does measure a good amount how much young men buy into a version of a stoic, tough guy, don't ask for help, don't seek help version of manhood. Across the set of questions that we developed, ranging from 30 to 50 to 60% of young men solidly in the box. Not surprisingly, the more you're in the box, oh, there's a delay here. One more, there we go. The more you are in the box, the more you both cause harm to others and have harm happen to you. All the negative outcomes that we included in there, very strong associations with how much you were in the box. You believed in those sets of views. Suicide ideation, binge drinking, traffic accidents, depressive symptoms, oops, there we go. Experiencing physical bullying, perpetrating physical bullying, sexual harassment against women or girls. Very strong associations. We knew this from other research. Lots of you do this as well. How strong those associations are. It is alive and well. It causes harm. There should be, and we'd hope at some point there might be enough data, and certainly I think API agrees with us, that you might want to see something like a Surgeon General's warning. Harmful ideas about manhood, restrictive ideas about manhood are bad for your health. There is enough data. I hope at the end of this we're all convinced. I think this is probably an audience that already gets it. We then took this to say, if you're not convinced by simply those strong associations, we can measure in real life cost terms, in addition to the harm, the innumerable, difficult to measure ones, we can also look at the economic costs. There we go. This study we're launching today, we've put it out in the media a couple of weeks ago, that we called the cost of the man box study. In the US, the calculation we came up to, I'll give you the result first, and then I'll show you our math of how we got there, just a little bit. I know nobody wants to look at a lot of formulas, but just a little bit. In the US, the cost associated with 6 key health outcomes, those ones I just listed, for young men ages 18 to 30 that we can attribute to being in the man box. There we go. $16 billion that we can measure at least that amount every year, attributable to, associated with those factors. And I'll show you how we got to that number. You're looking for a reference for that. That is about twice the CDC annual budget. That is more income that the NBA takes in every year. That is more than Americans spend on potato chips every year. There's a lot of numbers we could come up with. That's the amount that we spend on treating breast cancer in the US every year. That is a huge number in lives and public health costs. How we got this, we took 6 of those. It's a weird thing, I promise I'm not doing that. There's 6 of the negative outcomes that we looked at. We then took the proportion of those 6 outcomes that you could attribute, not causality, but at least association, correlation, that you could associate with the man box. There's those numbers. Next slide. There we go. Sorry, I'm going to go ahead and then come back. No. What am I doing wrong here? Anyway, I had it in a slightly different order, but we'll go with it. I'm having trouble getting this clicker to work for me. Here's the amount per category. We took the percentage that you could attribute to the man box and multiplied it by standardized health cost data that's available. Lost life, health systems cost, that is for hospitalization and health treatment, and third was lost productivity. These are standard numbers that health economists keep. You can find them across countries and come up with this number. It is at least that amount. There's a huge amount of intangibles. There's the harm to women that's largely not included in there of the harmful behavior of some men. So that measures, this is an undercount to be sure, but simply doing this kind of standard health economics analysis, you get to that number per year just for 18 to 30-year-olds, just on 6 of those outcomes, let alone many others that we know it's associated with. Thank you. I am allowed to ask for help. I'm feeling okay about asking for help. Okay, next slide. There we go. And this is not just if we did this in 2 other countries as well, and just want to show you as well the data from the UK and Mexico. We hope that other countries may be interested in this to use to make sense of just how much these harmful ideas about masculinities demand not only an attention in the health, in the education sector and the youth development sector, but also in the public health sector. Next one, please. And lest you think we're making this up, if this looks like Promundo did a really cool sleight of hand with some math in the back room and nobody can really tell how they did this, I'm thrilled that Cody, who's a lead author of a paper that we did that includes, Cody, at last count, there was at least 500 data reference points in a paper. Is that about right? 700, sorry, I was understating. 700 references from the public health literature, a reanalysis of the morbidity and mortality international data from the global burden of disease data to take a look at what's up with men's health, and we called this the Masculine Norms in Men's Health paper. The big headline from that is that 50% of premature male death and nearly 70% of male morbidity, that is, other health things that don't result in death, is attributable to, somebody's next slide, click it there for, 6 health risk behaviors. There's a cluster of these 6. What are these 6? Next slide, please. There's the 6, and there's the percentages. Poor diet, tobacco use, alcohol use, drug use, occupational hazards, unsafe sex, and health seeking, we think, is a glaring omission in there, but also needs to be part of it. No one's attributed that. Now, if you look at all 6 of those, 6 of those, none of those have to do with how we are born biologically male. There's nothing about the XY chromosome that makes us smoke more, that we found, that makes us eat poorly, that makes us work in hazardous work situations, that makes us abuse substances, that keeps us from seeking health services. These are all constructed, socially built things that we're calling the man box or masculine norms. Working now? Yeah, thank you. I'll call for help again if I I think it's important to call up just how much this huge burden of disease that men represent to health systems is not simply talking about men. We're talking about what it means in tax costs. We're talking about what it means to the women in particular, who, because of how we gender construct who does the care work, pick up the pieces when men are ill or when men die early or when men need help. So this is a cost that we think is not only, of course, in men's lives, but it matters to all of us. I think it's also important to say these 6 risk behaviors have a huge amount to do with the norms that we're talking about. And this is where our huge number, you can see the huge differences in male and female mortality that come about as a result of them. That is, they are heavily weighted toward men with the exception of unsafe sex, which women's morbidity and mortality there is typically because of men's behaviors. And again, we're looking at socially constructed behaviors carried out mostly by male-identified individuals. The weight of the public health data in the field says, again, like our Cost of the Man Buck study, pay attention to masculine norms. They are probably one of our hugest, biggest, if that's a word, social determinants of health. And it's been a challenge to get it taken seriously, and that's, as you all well know, and we'll hear from some of you who have been trying to get it taken seriously. In addition to mental health, it drives almost every single non-communicable disease that we are concerned about and that are the biggest burden to costs in terms of our health systems. So that sounds, and I want to think as we've presented this data, and we'll hear from our colleagues at APA as well, as we think about the Gillette ad, as we think about when the APA paper came out, as we think when we came out with the Man Box study, the huge amount of backlash and how much it can seem like we're such on fighting grounds to bring up and even question ideas about masculinity. At the same time, I think it's important to take one step back and look at a couple of data points. One, that 1 million persons who clicked that they didn't like the Gillette ad, that man who posted a picture of himself and his 2 children that he was teaching how to use guns and saying, you want to question my manhood, take this Gillette, I'm not buying your product anymore, gives the sense that somehow there's a lot of people against us. Gillette did a study afterwards and found that more than 70% of people in a random survey, not angry people survey, but a random survey, more than 70% actually liked it, were favorable toward Gillette because of it, and loved the message. So I think, as we think about some angry men who make noise about this, and sometimes angry women saying, you can't question my manhood, my son's manhood, my partner's manhood, my manhood, there are more folks on our side. And I'm sure we'll hear from, I've been hearing from Michael, who's got a book out that he'll tell us about later, of the number of mothers in particular who are saying, my God, finally we're talking about my sons. I haven't figured out how I talk with them and about them. I think there's a huge amount of appreciation for that we've opened this space. And I also want to just end on one other piece, which is to say it is important as we hold up these norms and question ideas about masculinity that we not fall back into that deficit perspective on our sons or on young men and on ideas about manhood, that we also pull out all the things that are there and the fact that our sons are ready to break out of this. And one piece of data, that a follow-on study that we did to the Man Box on bullying and online bullying, no shortage of young men carrying it out, no shortage of young men and young women who have experienced it. It is, we could call it the newest sport compared to esports. It is in the air and online all the time. One of the things that was important that we asked in this is using standard methods of measuring empathy. Young men were full of empathy. It was not an issue of we've got to fill their psyches with empathy. It is there. It is how much, however, that they said, as was said in the clip before, how much they feel like to show that version of manhood, to show my concern, to show my solidarity with others, to question the man box is to risk being critiqued, being harassed, being yelled at, getting a million dislikes because of an ad that you put out there. So just how much I think it's important to acknowledge. Let's start and remember that we're starting from that strength, that as we listen to and include the voices of young men and young women, that we be very careful that we don't take that deficit lens to a problem that is social and doesn't just reside in our bodies as men and women. With that, I now have the privilege to invite our first three speakers, so if I could invite you all up. Actually, let's do this one at a time. I'll invite you one at a time there. So thank you for that, and I want to thank again Cody, Brian, and everybody who contributed to the data. So I wanted to give them a hand for the work on this. If you haven't figured out, Promundo is about making data great again, so please tweet this, get it out there. We're among scientists, we can use data, and we hope that you'll help us get it out there just as we're retweeting APA stuff and hope that we can make more noise about it. So I am thrilled now to invite somebody whose work I knew about and then had a chance to meet and who was generous enough to be part of putting this together. So Derek, I'm going to let you introduce yourself because I'm not going to get your whole bio, but just thrilled to say Derek Griffith from Vanderbilt. You can do that.
Oh, yeah, that
Should be on. Yeah, it's coming up.
all right. Oh, either, am I gonna, okay. Give this back. See, I'm not above asking for help either. See, there you go. So, good afternoon. It is truly a pleasure to be here with you. Let me
That slide there wasn't time for.
That's okay.
That's what we're looking for at the end of the day.
There you go. So let me just say as I try to get to, there we go, me. So I'm thrilled first to be here with you, thrilled to partner finally with Gary and Promundo in these efforts and initiatives. Certainly Wisdom and I have been partners in crime in this work for a long time, and I've been a big fan of her work since she was actually a grad student. So I won't do the customary sort of pleasantries, but I'll get right to it in the interest of time because I know we have quite an exciting panel to follow us. So my goal in the time that I have is to really just provide a context for thinking about men's health. And I'll warn you ahead of time, I kind of had a little bit of, we'll call it inspiration. We'll see if you think it's inspiration. And it's going to be a little potential touchy, but I want you to kind of put this in context. So I'm going to talk about this in a racial, historical, and cultural context of how we think about some of both the positives and negatives of masculinity and manhood. Okay. So one of the most iconic images that we have about this idea of masculinity and manhood certainly comes from the Memphis sanitation workers strike in 1968, which was right at the cusp of actually Martin Luther King being assassinated within the week after that, and his efforts to really try to support these men and actually just kind of, again, being recognized as men. Now, what's striking here is a couple things. One is it doesn't say I'm a black man. It doesn't say, I am, in whatever, language it would have been in that time period. It was trying to gain respect and just recognition and equality just as a man and what they saw that as. And part of this, in terms of the sanitation workers and their aspirations to actually be just get sort of equal rights and equal opportunities to work in a safe environment, they saw that as being parallel to as being a fundamental part of who they were as men, to just be able to provide for their families, contribute to their families, and so forth. So part of my first point of this is there are these toxic aspects of masculinity that we talk about, but some of them that can actually negatively affect health may come from sometimes a positive place. So we have to kind of realize that some of the things that can have costs for health can actually come from aspirations to do things that are good. I wanted to also put in context that some of the language, some of the ways, and I apologize for the language, but this is what he used, so this is what I'm using. This is Lee Atwater in the context of what's called the Southern Strategy, which was basically the ways that at that time, Republican Party was trying to transition to figuring out how they were going to mobilize a population to think differently about how they were going to engage, particularly white Southerners, around these issues. And so, no, it's no accident that 1968, he's saying by 1968 you can't say this word, and that was the same year that Martin Luther King was killed. So these are not accidents that he was sort of identifying that in that time frame. The point is, when you have these kind of contexts and these ways of thinking about and talking about these issues, there's a context to understanding how people are approaching these things that we can't ignore. There's a political cost, there's a political choice that we're making, and some of the language and the rhetoric that you're seeing is part of this context of how we using what some have called dog whistle politics, or certain language that we've been able to sort of normalize in certain ways to get around some of the more explicit ways that we've seen these conversations go. This idea of making America great again, certainly to those of you who know, this is not a new idea. This certainly is an appropriation of what was going on during the 1980s, and certainly the war on drugs, and that disproportionately affected certain groups of men. And we know that this has certainly been appropriated more recently to fit this context and culture today. We saw, and actually Gary was just sharing with me as we were getting ready, that this has been and caused a rather contentious response. So my colleague at Vanderbilt, Jonathan Metzl, just published a book called Dying of Whiteness that talks about this idea of whiteness being this fundamental aspect of white people's investment in this idea of trying to promote or retain this idea of what it means to be white in a country. We haven't put that in a gender context, so it's no accident to me that all of the most visible responses that you've seen have been from white men. The people who came to this event and disrupted the event that Jonathan was speaking at and that Gary was actually apparently at, were all white men, and we're all actually white men in middle age. So there's no accident of these categories that we're sort of thinking about, of who's actually responsible for this, who's responding the most strongly to this. One of the things that, in the context of actually the report that Cody and Gary did in terms of these masculine norms in kind of a global context that I've been talking about, is this idea that premature mortality, and the idea that if you notice that one of the men's death rates and mortality rates are not necessarily, don't increase over time, in the sense that what you see is that the highest rates of premature mortality, or dying in the age of 30 to 70, is far higher in men than women. But we don't tend to think about that in a gender context. When we've talked about things like diseases of despair, this has gotten a lot of attention and so forth, and some have kind of tried to, combat this idea that, we've had this new rhetoric around diseases of despair and the deaths of middle-aged white folks who have a high school education or lower, and that their mortality rates, their rates of dying within that time frame, of these particular diseases, poisonings is really about opioid addiction and dying of that, suicide, chronic liver disease or from drinking, and then smoking, that deaths from those have dramatically increased, but only in that particular population. What we haven't seen, though, is this slide that shows that it was actually much higher in men than it is in women. So there's a lot of these places, my point is, there's a lot of these places where these narratives have not gotten the gender sort of context that they need to really understand how they play out, what implications they have for health, and how we need to intersect this idea of what race means to people of African descent, as well as to whites and to other groups, and what ethnicity means and so forth. We have to connect how these dots fit together and understand how even things like class and education also factor into this picture. So it's no accident that these particular combinations of being white, male, and a high school graduate or less in the 2000s has been a particular population where you've seen this huge backlash. And for that context to be, you know, the folks who, again, those were the folks who were mobilizing in the 80s, those were the folks who you're seeing now. So it's not a surprise that you're seeing this particular population struggle as the economy has shifted from the jobs that they were able to be successful in having the American dream during the 80s and other times that you were looking back to now being able to say, I'm struggling to be able to maintain this ideal of what it means to be a man in this particular context. So the point is also that, you know, a lot of times when we've talked about ideas of masculinity, manhood, we haven't sort of talked about them as being racialized, as the aspirations being different for different groups, that there are ideals that you're looking for, and it's not just this one monolithic idea that we have to think about. You know, Michael Kimmel very clearly talks about his characterization of manhood, but he's also very explicit to say his characterization of manhood is about middle-class white men. It's not about other groups of men and their ideas of masculinity and manhood. So there's this other book, Martin Summers, who's I think at Boston University, talks about, and again, sort of speaking back almost 100 years to these ideas of what it means to be a man from then, and you see surprisingly a lot of parallels that really haven't changed dramatically as the fundamental sort of roots of respectability politics really playing out, you know, over that time period has not fundamentally changed. Just so we're clear about sort of terminology, when I say respectability, I mean trying to achieve success in things like educational attainment, you know, social class, and even networks and so forth, economic success. Reputation are things that we tend to associate more with sort of these toxic masculinities and other kinds of ideals. The reason I mention both of them is because both of them have implications for health. Respectability and the stress of trying to achieve success in these things, whether you're the white men who are frustrated that they're not able to provide for their families and so they're taking it out in a context like Jonathan's book, you know, book showing and book, his publishing of the book and so forth, or if it's in other contexts and so forth, the stress of simply trying to be successful and live up to these aspirations have material costs, have implications for the physiological stress that men are going to experience and how it's going to adversely affect their health. Reputation tends to be more of what we're talking about when you think about the risk-taking behaviors that we've seen implicated in reports like the Man Box and those kind of things, and recognizing that it's really trying to, again, attain some level of respect and reputation and just sense of self that comes from my ability to be able to drink somebody under the table, be able to engage in certain risk behaviors, or be able to boast about other things that you're doing in other spaces. So the point is to map it on very specifically to specific ways that these particular ideals are both contextualized as well as being able to see how they're directly affecting health. So I'm going to stop there. I did want to do a shameless plug for a book that we have that's coming out. Actually, Gary has been gracious enough to write a chapter in there about policy and so forth. But it's the first effort to, from a sort of academic sense, to really try to put together in a global context men's health equity, which we're framing in the context of both understanding how to promote men's health, but we also need to understand how differences between men and women can be closed by taking a gender lens that doesn't advantage or disadvantage one or the other, but takes into account the need to consider both. So we've been trying to do that and been promoting that. So with that, I'm going to stop. So thanks.
Thank you, Gary. Yep, you can hear me? You can hear me not because of this, though. I'm thrilled now to invite Randy Palacios. He's a youth representative for the Partnership for Male Youth, which is one of our partners for putting this on. So Randy, over to you. cool. We missed some cool slides here.
Well, yeah.
There we go.
All right. Well, first, I'd like to begin by expressing gratitude for your attention today. So I'm going to be sharing my story today with you. And this story is about the intersectionality of violence and masculine norms from the place where I come from. So I was born in this really small country called El Salvador in Central America. So actually, I was born about 3 years after a civil war ended. So the Civil War was largely supported by the U.S. And in this war, about 70,000 people died over a decade. One of those people was actually a farmer who turned out to be my grandfather. My other grandfather actually had to flee the country because he was, they were claiming that he was a guerrilla military man when he really wasn't. So my grandfather, who was a farmer, he was actually tortured and killed by the government and military. And my dad had actually had to go to the morgue when he was 10 years old and recognize his body just to make sure that that was his dad. So from that point on, you know, his whole life began to change. From ages 10 to 22, they would recruit, you know, young guys like this. And my father would, you know, deny or be reluctant to join any of these groups because he didn't want to inflict any violence on anyone. And they would oftentimes beat him and, you know, claim that if he was a man, that he was able to kill someone. And so they started integrating, you know, violence with the norms of what it meant to be a man during that time. And obviously, women were no different. They also used various methods to coerce women into joining the Civil War. And so at 25 years old, my dad created a family in a really small town in La Libertad. And so that's little Randy right there. So that picture was taken when I was in pre-K. I really love that lunchbox. So I want to share with you, actually, this picture I think was taken perhaps during really one of my first sort of memories in childhood, which was that after I got out of pre-K one day, my mother and I would walk home, and she would hold my hand every time, and we would walk home about 2 blocks away, so it wasn't too far away. But in one of those occasions, we noticed a group of people in a corner, and as soon as she saw the group of people in the corner, then she immediately lets go of my hand, sort of really unexpectedly, and starts running towards the people. I was super confused because, you know, like I'm 4 years old, so I don't really know what's going on. And so I start chasing after her, and then I'm curious to see, like, what is in front of, like, all of these people, like, what are they looking at? And so I was small enough to just sort of like swim my way through the legs of adult people. And then I got in between the circle, and what I saw was this man who had completely been run over by a huge bus, and his whole body was cut in half. So he was screaming, he was still alive, and since I was really small, he extended his hand and like begged me to help him. And so, you know, I'm 4 years old, so I don't really know like what to do or like how to feel. And so I just looked up at the people around me. And what I saw was that everyone had this very indifferent look on their faces. So everyone just sort of seemed like, it's just another day. Because all those people who'd been, growing up in the war, they were now adults. And so those adults had seen so much violence that it wasn't really that big of a deal to see someone die in front of them. But what that did was that they were not displaying any empathy for the person who was dying, and there wasn't any empathy for me, who was experiencing that for the first time. And so my mother quickly pulls me out of the circle, and the first thing that she says is, men are supposed to be strong, so don't ever talk about this with anyone. And so I listened to her advice, and it wasn't actually until recently, last year, where I was in therapy and I actually remember this memory, and it just completely changed the way that I started thinking about empathy and compassion towards other people. So this is me. When I was 12 years old, I came to the US as an unaccompanied minor from El Salvador. And so this was my first outing in the US. I went to a monster truck show. And during this time, I was really depressed. I basically, just left my entire family in El Salvador and was now living with my dad, who I wasn't really able to connect with. That all that time that was separated from him, I sort of developed this sort of independence, and it was really hard for me to connect with him again. At age 15, so 3 years after I came to the U.S., I experienced a lot of sort of domestic violence from my dad, because he grew up in violence also, and so anytime I would try to express with him how I was feeling because I left home and all the sadness, he would just tell me that like men are not really supposed to feel anything, that you're just supposed to man up. And so later on, I started noticing, a lot of anger bursts. And so I thought about challenging that violence in a controlled manner. So I started picking up martial arts. So I did MMA for a while. And even then, in that arena, I think I also experienced a sense of a masculine norm of, even if you get injured, like you're supposed to just man up and keep going. Like that was the norm. And so in this picture, actually, I tore a tendon in my knee, but I was, just still trying to fight through with a guy that's like twice as heavy as me. All right, and so now it comes to how this has all affected my personal relationships. So, I was married to this girl who I really loved, and then I would always be so disconnected from myself that I wasn't really able to listen to any of her emotions. So anytime that, she would express any concerns about small things, then I would just sort of claim that she was too sensitive for me, or that if she expressed her needs, that she was needy. And so obviously that had detrimental consequences, and we ultimately split. So this guy, this continued happening over and over in my life. And as an undocumented person, you're not really able to have access to any sort of healthcare, so it's really hard for you to get therapy. So I started thinking about, well, what are the ways that I could sort of try to fix myself? And I came across the work of this guy. His name is Marshall Rosenberg, and he was driven by two questions. So one of the questions was, what is it that makes us violent? And the second question is, how could we create the kind of connection that makes compassionate giving possible? And so I really started studying his book called Nonviolent Communication. And what I found was two really main key principles. I don't really have the time to walk you through everything, but the first one is this wheel of feelings. So if you look to your left, these are sort of the unpleasant negative feelings that you may have at any given point. To your right, those are the feelings when your needs are getting met. So that means that you have positive feelings. This was really important for me to have because as a man, I've been programmed to sort of neglect my connection with my own emotions. And quite honestly, I didn't even have a vocabulary to express them. And so just having that was like really important for me. So once you identify the feelings, well, first you begin by asking, what is it that you're feeling? Or better yet, like, what is it that you're unwilling to feel? And so once you identify the feeling, then you can move on to the next circle, which is the wheel of needs. And what this does is basically allows you to identify whether your needs are being met, depending on whatever feeling you have. So what I began doing was I started journaling every morning, and I'm gonna share with you one of my daily journals. So ideally, I do this in the morning just to sort of see where I am. So I list 3 feelings. You can just take a look at the wheel and identify the feelings, and then you can reflect on why you may be having those feelings. And then on the second part, once you identify those feelings, then you are identify the needs that are being met or not being met. And once you have that, then it becomes a little easier for you to just start creating an actionable plan specific to time and place that you can take steps to just, remedy whatever feeling it is that you're having. So, for example, like I've been feeling lonely, so I have a need for connection, and so I can maybe call up my grandma and just talk about my childhood memories, and so that was really important for me to have. And so I guess I would just want to end with, I think if we fail to create systems and structures that enable us to have a profound connection, specifically among men, we'll continue to develop leaders that are, use their power to dehumanize other people and disconnect generations and genders. And I think our challenge is to create an empathetic and compassionate community where men are able to share their own feelings and needs, and they feel a sense of freedom from not having this systematic norms of gender norms. And so I think I'm going to leave you with 2 questions. So just to enable the values, we can begin the values of empathy and compassion. We can, begin by acknowledging our own humanity and by asking, what is it that you're feeling, and what is it that you're unwilling to feel? So, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Randy, thanks so much, Randy, for sharing so honestly. We know about the man box and all of that, how that's not always the easiest thing for us as male-identified individuals, so thank you very much for sharing that. I'm now thrilled to introduce Wisdom Powell, who we had the chance to know about but finally got to meet in person, who's at the University of Connecticut, one of the co-authors of the APA report and president-elect of Division 51, which works on men and masculinities here at the American Psychological Association. So Wisdom, thrilled to have you here.
So good morning. I like to roam a little bit, so I'm going to try to stay behind the podium, but I can't promise discipline with that. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about masculinity and mental health, sort of setting up the stage, although I would add that the previous speakers have already done all of what I probably will do in the 7 minutes, but I'll try to add some nuance. I want to start with this warning. So Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie masterfully warns us of the dangers of a single story. And Chimamanda warned us that single stories are dangerous, not because they're untrue, but because they tell incomplete and isolated truths, flatten lived experience, and emphasize stereotypes above all other shared aspects of humanity. And this warning is particularly useful as we contemplate what we think we know and what we know about connections between masculinities and mental health. But to disrupt single stories, we have to start by deconstructing the frame. And often when we're talking about the mental health of boys and men, we start with the boys and men as problems frame. And we rarely end up with a frame that positions boys and men as potential wonders to behold. The single story about masculinity positions it as static, universal, fixed, and deterministic, rather than as precarious, situational, and rooted in really long-standing socio-historical, hierarchical arrangements. The single story fails to capture the nuance of masculinities that are expressed by men who are operating at society's margins. Men who have developed, in contrast to what we've been talking about, proactive, redemptive, and pro-social meanings and definitions of manhood. The single story also convinces us that masculinity is either purely biological or social. It leads us down this rabbit hole of the either-or fallacy, when the truth is, a whole story, a more complex story, is that masculinity is both. And that boys and men do not enact masculinities uniformly, nor ones that are inherently or irreparably toxic. The truth about mental health among boys and men are as follows. We know that men are diagnosed with depression less often than women, yet have higher rates of suicide completion. This is often described as the gender paradox in mental health. And we know that this paradox is likely explained by the fact that men tend to use more lethal means. But we also know that a great amount of the suicide rates in our country are probably also explained by the fact that men don't seek help or care for their health problems at the same rates that women do. And even as we're talking about the opioid crisis in this country, we're still not talking about the fact that more men and boys in the U.S. perish prematurely from drug overdose deaths when compared to women. That's a whole and a more complex story. So what we know about masculinity and mental health is still evolving. We know that the pressure to be a man about it impacts risk-taking, stress response, and health behavior among some boys and men. We know that boys and men are often taught to place a high value on the display of physical and mental toughness. As we sit here in this room, somewhere on some playground, anywhere USA, there is a boy who has fallen down, who has a scraped knee, and someone is telling him to walk it off. Take it like a man. Boys don't cry. And we know that when men hold more strongly and rigidly to these definitions of adherence to those stereotypical aspects of masculinity, that we see poorer mental health outcomes. But in order to disrupt the single story, we also have to confront broader social disparities that can compound mental health challenges in vulnerable boys and men. We know that there are men and boys who are operating at margins of societies, of U.S. society and global societies that are suffering immensely from undetected, undertreated mental health problems. If we were telling a whole and complex story, we would be speaking the names of Gabriel, Rylan, and Nigel, Black boys who have recently perished as a result of suicide. We would be talking about the fact that masculinity is not all bad for mental health, but there are some aspects of masculinity that deserve further interrogation and deconstruction. We know also that if we were going to have a conversation that was a whole story, a more complex story, that we would be talking not just about the failure of men and boys to seek help. We'd be talking about the system's failure, the failure in our capacity to listen and respond to the distress signals that boys and men send. We will be talking about redesigning health systems so that when we build it, boys and men will come. And when they come to those systems will respond in kind to the kinds of emotional distress that they tell us about. So the way forward really is to tell whole and complex stories. We have to reimagine masculinity. What do we have to lose? What would we be giving up by reimagining masculinities? We have to invest in systems change. We have to translate the evidence, even that we're presenting in this room, into meaningful action. And we also have to align strategies so that we're not duplicating effort. We're not reproducing old, rehashed stories that fail to grasp the significance and the depth of the pain that men and boys are in. And so while we're debating Is masculinity biological or social? While we're debating, is it universal or deterministic? Boys and men are being ground into dust by the emotional distress that they're feeling. And we owe it to them. We owe it to Nigel. We owe it to Randy to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about their interior lives and the full range of their humanity.
Thank you, Wisdom. And I think your slide is a good one to leave up to join us to where do we go from here. And that's what we want to do with the panel now. There's we've got 5 key experts in this field to precisely interrogate this. How do we think about moving this into action in different spaces? So thank you for setting us up with that. We'll have a panel and then we'll open up to general questions. So I'm now thrilled. I'll invite up first David Bell. David runs the Young Men's Clinic at Columbia University. David, welcome. Go ahead. Next, please invite up, where's Ed Adams? Dr. Ed Adams, he's the past president of Division 51 of the American Psychological Association and also one of the co-authors of the report on boys, young men, and mental health. Ed, welcome. Well, thank you for welcoming us, is what I meant to say, Ed. Next, we've got Sana Chahimi from Prevention Institute. Sana, welcome. And Farood Mabodi, who's with Wayfarer Entertainment that brought us the film, and we'll talk more about that. Farood, welcome. And finally, Michael Reichert with the University of Pennsylvania and author of How to Raise a Boy, that's on in bookstores close to you now. Welcome, Michael. Excuse me here, I'm going to sit down. We'll start on my left. We'll start in the same order that introduce folks, and we'll do a first round and then want to open it up a little bit. So first question to David. You're running one of the handful of specialized young men's clinics. You're doing this as a practitioner and health educator. Tell us how these ideas around promoting healthy masculinities, how reimagining masculinities, that whole set of 4, which is, again, a great slide to have us to drive us forward. How do you put this to practice as a health practitioner, health provider?
So I revised my comments, partly because of our last speakers. Thank you. I want to say that the experience of the Young Men's Clinic, and I've been at Columbia University for 20 years now as the medical director for the Young Men's Clinic. What we've seen is that it's grown from 750 unique patients a year to now 3,400 unique patients a year with 3 providers. And we serve a group of young men from ages 14 to 35, the ones that usually don't seek health care in general. The internal medicine doctors usually say that they're the lost sort of segment of our healthcare system, and they come back after 40. What I've found, though, is that if you connect with them, they connect with you, and that they're incredibly vibrant and want to sort of work with you. The transformation of healthcare really needs to be sort of helping them know that you care and helping them know that you want to connect. And that's what a healthcare doesn't do at this point in time. Some of the other things that I would say that what we're trying to do and what I'm working, one with Gary and one with Partnership for Male Youth, we are sort of engaging clinicians and young people like Randy to sort of help inform clinicians and sort of in general policies around what it means to work with adolescent and young adult males. And for Promundo, another way we're engaging the healthcare system is we've done a training on the Manhood 2.0 curriculum that Promundo has adapted for the U.S., and we've trained 13 clinicians, health psychologists, social workers, and health educators in our hospital system and our school-based clinic system to bring that curriculum into their psychological sessions and into their school lunch sessions with our young men in our schools in New York City.
All right, thanks. Ed, you were part of writing APA's guidelines that came out last year, and yeah.
says on. Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay. I wasn't part of writing it, but they were released during my administration as president.
So you took the heat
Yes.
when they came out.
It got me on Laura Ingram's show, so
Okay.
that's taking a lot of heat.
So tell us a little bit about what's in them, and how do we build a better field of mental health professionals to understand these issues? And I'll add a second question that you started to touch on, that heat, and where do
Yes.
we go from there? Yeah.
Okay. Well, the guidelines were approximately 12 or 13 years in the making, and they were the first time that Division 51 or APA had established guidelines for the treatment of boys and men. And the purpose of the guidelines, they're intended for practitioners. They are ideas. They are suggestions for practitioners to keep in mind when working with boy or men populations. And there were 10 in total. I won't go through the 10 because you could do your due diligence and look them up online, but they are all intended to be both research-based, practical, and applicable to clinical settings. They are useful in the sense of references for clinicians to be mindful about their work with men and boys. To give you an example, I was called, a psychologist in a local psychological group called me and said, "We understand you have a specialty with boys and men, and we'd like for you to come and talk to our fellow psychologists about the treatment of boys and men." I said, "I'd be happy to do that." And then there was a pause in the conversation, and she said, "But what is there to talk about?" My jaw dropped. One of the things that I've realized is that men don't know, and a lot of clinicians don't know, that men have a gender. The questions aren't asked, the suggestions aren't given, nothing is probed, nothing is sought out in terms of a cause for some of the distress that men have. And so it becomes this amorphous thing that disappears in a clinician's office. So one of the first things that I suggest is that clinicians recognize that gender is a real factor and can be very constructive or destructive. Another thing that I want clinicians to know from the guidelines is that men are capable of extraordinary things. Extraordinary love, sacrifice, devotion, commitment. Another thing that I want clinicians to know from the guidelines, and this is very important too, is that men live in fear, threat, and danger. And that evokes the response to avoid, the response to shut down, the response to flee. And so when men are, Robert Bly once said that when a group of men get together, can violence be far behind? He's not just talking about physical violence, but emotional violence. And the fourth thing is that men are capable of enormous compassion, but typically don't know much about self-compassion. There's a sign in my men's center that says, "I never beat myself up gently." Yeah. And any man who reads that, frankly, any woman who reads that, understands what that means. So the guidelines are intended to help people who are working with boys and men to pay attention to the nuance and sometimes to the obvious that is being ignored.
Thanks. Sana Prevention Institute runs and supports some really fascinating and well thought out mental health interventions with young men and adult men across the U.S. Would love to hear, and I think you've got a couple of colleagues here who run some of those directly who are here in the audience with us. Would love to hear what can you do? What can we do at the community level? What's working in that? Tell us about those interventions.
Right. Thank you so much. I also just want to say thank you for having Prevention Institute be part of this amazing event. So I'm here on behalf of Prevention Institute and more importantly as the mother of 2 boys. So I want to thank all of the amazing speakers and panelists, especially you, Randy. That was incredibly powerful. So thank you for that gift. I want to pick up on a theme that we've been hearing today about connection and how powerful connection is for all of our mental health. Prevention Institute is fortunate with generous funding support and partnership by the Movember Foundation to have developed and launched a U.S. initiative called Making Connections for Mental Health and Well-Being Among Men and Boys. And Making Connections works with 13 community coalitions across the U.S. in suburban, rural, urban communities, and works on transforming the conditions in communities, so the community environments that influence mental health and well-being, either for young men and boys of color or military service members, veterans, and their families. And a really powerful part of the Making Connections initiative was that it started with a really intentional planning phase. And this allowed the young men and boys to really engage in defining for themselves what their community strengths and assets were around mental health and well-being, and what aspects of their community environments they felt needed to be transformed in order to achieve greater well-being across their population. And what we learned during this planning phase, that process of planning was in and of itself healing and therapeutic. That the opportunity to decide on what action to take rather than merely being acted upon, the opportunity to shape your own narrative rather than having one singular, incomplete story told about you, really set a foundation for agency and a foundation for social cohesion that they were then able to take into the implementation phase of the initiative. And I'll just give one quick example. I'm not going to do it justice, but just to give you a glimpse of the kind of amazing work these sites are doing. So the Making Connections site in San Diego, one of the leading partners there is the United Women of East Africa support team. And after an increase in deaths by suicide among young East African men in that community, this Making Connections site began to engage with the men to ask them, what do you need? What are you looking for to help support your mental health and well-being? And their answer was that they wanted a place to connect with each other and be themselves. They felt that they were wearing so many different masks at home, at school, in public in the community to try to fit in, and they were facing racism on a daily basis, anti-immigrant sentiment, Islamophobia, that they needed a safe space to reconnect with each other and to reconnect with their culture. So during the planning phase, they started by forming a Making Connections hub. So by providing this space for connection and learning and support. And what they're now able to do, so once they've established that, is that now these young men and leaders are speaking out together and they're advocating on policies that they've determined they want to see improved in their own community to shape their own mental health and well-being. And they've selected safe and affordable housing as the policy that, one of the policies that they're advocating for. So it kind of shows what can happen when you provide that time and that space for those connections to happen and the self-determination to make decisions about how to move forward.
All right, thank you. Ferd, you make media content. Often we'll kind of be in a room and go, oh, we should talk to the media and get them to make more interesting content. You're one of those makers of more interesting content. So thrilled to hear from you. What can you as media, what can you do as media, what can we do to influence and get more positive messages of the kind that you're showing in Man Enough? Tell us about Man Enough. Tell us about how you think media can be part of this.
Thank you. I think the first step is to realize that this current landscape of the country that we're in did not just appear out of thin air, right? Life imitates art. So what we see in film and what we see in television and what I listen to in every hip-hop song I heard throughout high school, the marginalization of women, the lessening of women, the objectification of women, right? This encoded me at a very young age to look at women a certain way, to look at my masculinity a certain way. You know, when I saw Vito Corleone and his stoic nature, when I saw John Rambo, when I saw all these actors, every Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, current Avengers films, right? This is a very rigid view of what it is to be a man, and this is being beamed into everyone's mind on a daily, minute-by-minute basis, right? So from my perspective, the first thing we can do is recognize the problem. And the problem does not exist in young children when they're born. I do not believe this. I do not believe that children are born recognizing these fraudulent gender norms. I think we program them, and I think from a societal landscape, from a parental landscape, from a religious landscape, I mean, the Garden of Eden, Eve, talk about misogyny, right? These things encode us as people. It's all storytelling. So my entry point is I create TV shows. I create digital campaigns, and everything that me and my company do is focused upon using media as a means of deprogramming the American population, right? That's a mouthful. So the goal is if media is what got us here, from my perspective, then media can liberate us, right? We have a very unique opportunity right now because Gen Z and millennials are far more intelligent. I mean, look at Randy. Come on, guys. Wow, brother. I'm in awe of you. There's more like Randy. Younger people are more in touch with their empathy, more in touch with their integrity. They're so smart. Young people, 50% of them are so smart, they don't even watch television. That's how intelligent they are. They don't watch commercials. Why? Because they know they're fraudulent. They know who Don Draper is. They know. So where do they go? They go online. Right? So this is a very unique opportunity. So what we do at Wayfair Entertainment is we partner with nonprofit organizations, we partner with academics, we partner with philosophers, and we create content that sets to facilitate conversations focused in human connection. And Man Enough is one of those projects. And you know, Man Enough started out 4 years ago. I took that show into every room in Hollywood. And I sat in with every patriarchal white guy in a boardroom, and I said, I wanted to do a dinner conversation show about traditional masculinity. And they said, no one's ever going to watch that. And then I want to ask them, sir, who do you have to talk to? And they told me to get out of their office. So we ended up making the show ourselves. And Man Enough is a dinner conversation featuring influential men talking about body image, sexual assault, vulnerability, communication, all the things that we're told not to do. And the goal of the show is to use influential men to give men at home permission to have these conversations in their own lives. And I think all the incredible work all you academics are doing and the policymakers is so important, but if we can't present that to the masses in a means that they can listen and understand, we're not going to see any change. And I think it's really powerful. To close, Man Enough has been seen over 20 million times with no marketing budget whatsoever. The episodes range from 30 minutes to an hour and 10 minutes. And it's all word of mouth, and it's all socially spread.
Right. Thank you. Michael, you've been both doing this work in clinical settings, school settings, educating parents for a long time. You've got a book that's making some good noise called How to Raise a Boy. What are you telling parents and teachers about how to raise a boy?
Hello, everyone. Yes, emphasize a long time. I've been in clinical practice and working as a consultant in schools and doing research for 40 years. And what I tell parents and schools right now at this particular time is there's never been, I think, in history, a better time to be raising a boy. The unthoughtful, taken for granted reproduction of historic traditional masculinity has been disrupted by the women's movement. We owe a great debt of gratitude to the way that the women's movement has disrupted that thoughtless intergenerational reproduction. And we are, as parents, as educators, as mentors, searching for. I was talking to an audience of parents recently. One mom raised her hand and said, let's get down to it. I just want to know how to raise a boy who's not going to become an asshole. You know, we call that phenomenon toxic masculinity. I'm not a fan of the term because I think it actually misleads us. The problem resides in the boyhood that we construct for our sons, and our sons are not in charge of that. I've got a 2.5-year-old grandson, actually, and I can see him absorbing the messages of masculinity, particularly about the degree to which this wonderfully facile and profound and robustly emotional boy is shutting down. He's learning to adapt himself to cultural cues, just the way Randy's mom helped shape him. So two facts, I think, are worth thinking about when we think about families and we think about schools. The first is a statistic that the Manbox research that Promundo did uncovered, which was when they asked these young men, where did they get these messages, 60% in the U.S. said from their parents. We parents carry these thoughts, these ideas in our hearts, in our unconscious minds, and we unwittingly pass them along. I did it with my 2 sons, caught myself and had to go back and correct, but sometimes I didn't catch myself, and that's what intergenerational transmission looks like. We carry stuff. And so a big part of what we've got to do with families is simply help them notice themselves and develop some kind of reflection about what they're carrying and what they're passing along. When it comes to schools, one of the things we have to acknowledge is that every school is occupied by what we call a hidden curriculum that's tremendously consequential, that kids form their sense of self in the looking glass. You know, I am who I see other people think of me as, and we internalize those beliefs about ourselves. So a big part of the work that I'm doing in schools is using a tool called Youth Participatory Action Research to excavate, this is fancy language, excavate the hidden curriculum, bring it into awareness where it's not going to be so thoughtlessly reproduced in comments and policies and practices and so forth. And the other thing I would say, just yesterday I was in a school. I've been consulting at a boys' school outside of Philadelphia for 30 years, and I've been leading an emotional literacy program there. That program has been called what the boys say is the most popular program in the school. We had yesterday, and yesterday was the final meeting of the year, we had 24 seniors saying goodbye. They got 90 seconds each to rotate in a chair, that chair, and come up and say goodbye. And I would warrant that half of them cried as they spoke about the difference that having the opportunity to talk about their feelings in an environment. And I'm not a magician. All I did was legitimize. Yeah, you have feelings. You need to talk about them. You need to talk about them to each other, which means you can't really be that hard on each other. That's all it took. If we build it, they will come. That's, I think, my bottom line message.
All right. Thanks. I'd have about 40 questions, but I want to open up in a couple of minutes for the other participants to make some questions. But maybe I'll just put one, or well, actually it's going to be two questions to all of you, and just take a minute kind of to think about and respond. One, I guess, what's all five of you related practice that is necessary, urgent, and working. So maybe one question is how to make it bigger. The number of young men, adult men, parents, mothers, fathers, individuals of all sexual orientation and gender identities need more of what all of you are involved in making. How would you turn up the volume? And related to that, maybe just reminding us of kind of like what's behind us in this. How do we think of both building on what kinds of policies need to be in place? What can we do to bring this into? Let's hold aside the craziness that's happening and let's imagine, and particularly there are lots of good policymakers trying to do good jobs every day in government agencies around this country. How would we take some of these issues better and even more into public policy? So yeah, how to turn up the volume and how might we connect better to public policy? Anybody want to take a first stab at that?
Sure. So I have a unique perspective. To me, I think whether you look at a Trump administration or an Obama administration, it's still a patriarchal system. America as a country was founded upon certain ideas, and while the representatives of government might change, I think the overall systems are very problematic. And, we as Wayfair, we're outside of politics. I want nothing to do with politics because I think the minute I talk about politics, 50% of people shut off. So we try to stay out of it, and I really appreciated what Gary, you and this gentleman said about never saying toxic masculinity, because I think it's just a highly problematic way of framing things. For me, I think the route to our success is in coalition building. We're all very fragmented. It's just really cool actually to be in this room with all of you right now, because normally, I'll be on a panel or in a room and I'm the only person really interested in this subject. So it's so awe-inspiring to be around all of you. But I think we as change makers, if we can open up to recognize that each of us brings something unique to the table in regards to this conversation, and that if we're really going to chip away at this outdated system that has permeated globally, we need to come together, and we need to recognize that the values that we're promoting, we have to live them. And I think that this is where we really fall apart a lot. Because it's really easy to go in and talk about stuff, and you're like, hey, rah, rah, we should all be doing this. But then in our personal lives, we're not really good at doing it. So I think, to quote Michael Jackson, it starts with the man in the mirror. We get, how am I showing up in my daily lives? How am I showing up to my children? And I think if we can have better dialogue amongst each other, to say, how can I be of service to you? How can you be of service to me? How can we amplify each other's messages? I think it's very helpful. With Man Enough specifically, we created an educational curriculum that went along with the show. So it wasn't just a show. There was a curriculum that viewers could read, and we made that in conjunction with different academics who were then featured on the project.
All right. Thanks. Anybody else want to jump in? How do we turn up the volume? How do we...
Let's see. Okay. About 30 years ago, a therapy group that I was doing turned into what is now a nonprofit organization called Men Mentoring Men. And we have served hundreds of men over the past 30 years and have had extraordinary results on a not a huge scale, but on a larger scale. For example, we did a survey within our group, and we call Men Mentoring Men M3, and we ask the question, since being part of M3, I am more convinced than ever in the benefits of sharing life issues with other men. Well, agreed or strongly agreed were 99% of the responders. We asked, since you became part of this group, have you been more able to identify and feel strong emotions? 66% said yes. And another question, I believe that my participation in M3 has increased the overall quality of my life. And we had a 93% of the responders saying, I agree, or strongly agree. So there's some power in men getting together in a shame-free environment where they learn to teach each other their skills, and they share their skills. So one way to make this larger is to create the collaboration that you're talking about, and also a curriculum so that if somebody in Utah wants to start a men's group, they have a place to be trained or resources to respond to, and a curriculum that they can refer to so that they could get 2, 3, 4 men together. M3 started with 3 men and now has well over 100 active members, and we are in 4 ongoing groups in 2 geographic locations. So it is exportable, it is expandable, and it is valuable. The beneficiaries are not only the men in the group, but their wives, their partners, their children. It's exponential.
All right, thank you.
There we go. Focusing on the mental health and well-being portion of the conversation, I also think we have an opportunity and a responsibility to expand the boundaries of that policy conversation. So, I mean, right now, Congress is actually paying attention to opioids, increased rates of suicide, the fact that life expectancy is actually decreasing, and they're trying to figure out what the appropriate policy solutions are, which largely to date have been about treating the problem after the fact and ensuring that there are dollars out there for care and treatment, which is incredibly important. And we also have an opportunity and a responsibility to talk about what needs to be in place up front and how do we expand the approach that's being taken from focusing on the needs of individuals to the needs of entire communities. And that means that we can link a whole bunch of different policy solutions to this work. It's about how we're investing in education. It's about how we're investing in parks and open space and places where young men and boys can get together and connect with one another. So it becomes a broader conversation about solutions that are right now the focus is a little bit more narrow in scope.
Thank you.
So my thoughts are building on Farul's. Basically building coalitions that it's beyond just medical, it's educators, it's large groups and swaths of sort of professionals and individuals that come in contact with men that really need to change their perspective about how we work with, in my context, adolescent and young adult males that builds on, but from boys on up. I'm stealing from Michael something he said at one of our conferences, is that our teachers really forget to connect and understand boys, and when they back away, it's not that they're not it's not that they're not wanting to be there. You're just not understanding what they need, and you need to connect to them. And so I think that's a really important space for us to understand how to communicate and how to get to the young men that are out there. That being, in addition, I would say that we're better at trying to train our clinicians to be more empathetic, but what I do think we leave out is sort of a gendered way of interacting with our young men and boys in general. We leave out fathers incredibly in all of our sort of spaces, and I think that's to a detriment to our families in general. I could go on, but I'll stop.
Thanks. Cool.
Just add, I'm going to put my money on boys. Every boy known and loved. I think that's our standard. That's our ambition. Because what we know is that if a boy has an ally, someone who has his back, that boy is going to resist the hypermasculine norms that pull him away from his heart and from who he is. So every boy known and loved, whether that's in a school and training teachers to conceive of themselves as allies and advocates and mentors, and in families, making sure that we're offering the kinds of supports that let parents be present and pay attention to their sons. I think that's where I put my money.
All right, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes to open up for questions. There's a lot of folks like Warren here who have also experts in this topic and doing both clinical work and educational work. Would love to, hear from you all. Questions, comments. Let's take, I'll suggest we take 3 and then see who wants to respond, and we'll come back. You could also make questions to any of the first 3 speakers if you want. So just, if the question is addressed to one person in particular, please do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Ed's, wonderful talk about the guidelines. I was a member of the APA guidelines. I'm Warren Spielberg. I teach at the New School, just FYI. When we wrote the guidelines, there was, just to add to your picture, we wanted to also encourage institutional change. We wanted to get the guidelines out. And thanks to Fox News, we've been very successful. Not successful enough. We have a way to go. And particularly just institutional changes. I'll mention schools, criminal justice, and the way parents continue to raise boys. In terms of schools, if you read the guidelines, you know that you can see that there's so many biological disorders that boys suffer from, attention deficit, delayed language, that affects them in school, and schools are not really set up, as we know, for boys. I want to address also about schools, which I had a hand in getting in our book about black boys, the enormous disparities in suspension and punishment of boys of color that has not changed. That is getting worse in actuality, starting now at preschool level, where young boys of color are being suspended and disrupted from school at very earlier ages. This is a very traumatizing event. Parents need, of course, we want to get out the word, the parents have to treat boys like they're young males in need of protection, not to deprive them early, not to traumatize them by pulling away love. This is extremely, of course, dysfunctional for boys and for men. The third point I want to make about the criminal justice system, we tried to get in the idea that so much of the activity of young men is moved by early trauma. If you're traumatized early, you can't learn. Yeah. This begins the school to prison pipeline. We wanted to get that across to criminal justice. Just by FYI, the DA in New York, I recently gave a talk for the My Brother's Keeper conference in Oakland, and the DA of New York was there. And they're starting a trauma initiative, an institute that's going to reach out to all the criminal justice players in New York. So that's the kind of thing we need more of. In terms of policy things, I can name a few off the top of my head. The most important for me is very strict guidelines with teeth, with consequences for school districts that are continue to just overly discipline boys of color. That's one. Two, I think we have to bring in trauma-informed treatment to the criminal justice system. And of course, we have to support more fatherhood initiatives, as David was talking about. Anyway, we're just beginning. If you read the guidelines, they're not perfect. It leaves out sex. That's a big problem for me. But we're in new times. The last thing I'll say is that the guidelines do stress the idea of masculinities. gender nonconforming folk are included. This is good. We have a lot more work to do, and I think we're at the beginning of trying to get the guidelines out to the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. A couple of other hands. Yeah,
Hi, I'm Sue Klein from the Feminist Majority Foundation, and I was just wondering, it seems that not all, but many of the solutions some of you were suggesting were solutions that I assume are evidence-based for use in all male settings. And I was wondering, since you also seem to stress, many of you, the idea of collaboration, what are the evidence-based solutions and alternatives for co-ed settings where males can learn from females and vice versa?
excellent. Any other? Yep, up here in the front.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers for a fascinating talk. My name is Debolina. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins SAIS University. My question was actually something that I wonder about, is that in reframing some of the education that we're talking about, values that were not always but traditionally associated with masculinity, like valor in the face of adversity, sacrifice, and some of the other values that were mentioned, what are some ways from your own experiences in different fields on how those values can still be inculcated but maybe reframed to not be as harmful as they have been? Thank you.
And Josie.
Hi, my name is Josie Lair, and I run a project called the Men's Story Project, which is a research-based public storytelling initiative where diverse men and folks who identify with maleness share very personal stories in front of live audiences of their own communities, be it campus or geographic or other communities, that challenge masculinity norms, but through the lens of their own life experience. And I just wanted to ask, well, first of all, I'd love to collaborate with folks in this room, so I'd love to meet everyone here. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about the idea of coalition building, because I know that I'm one person and I've reached out a lot, and I would love to be collaborating more with people, but how can maybe groups that are more resourced, that have bigger platforms, possibly do more to be reaching out to those groups that maybe are doing really solid work, but aren't as well known or as well connected, because I think there are a lot of good ideas and a lot of good work happening out there.
Yeah,
thanks.
Let's turn back to the panelists and then the three of you as well, if anybody wants to comment on those questions and comments. I don't know if anybody wants to start first. So we had a question about, are we doing this young men only, or are we doing this together in co-educational mixed spaces? How to connect more among us and practitioners and offering some of the platforms. A comment around how do we pull out some of the positive in some traditional ideas about masculinities that we think are worth perhaps repolishing and making useful for the world now, and Warren's comments on particularly around trauma and on taking on the justice system and the criminalization of the bodies of boys and men of color. Three, if not four, quite big topics. Anybody want to take it first? I see. Derek, you want to comment? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely am not going to try to tackle all of these. But I did want to speak to the question of the co-ed spaces versus single gender spaces. Men's health, I've always said, is not something that men can do alone, and that particularly in the context of, I work more with middle-aged and older men, that we know that men's health is more in the context of their relationship with women than women's health is in men. So men are fundamentally influenced by the women in their lives, positively usually influenced by the women in their lives when it comes to their health. Many of the positive influences for getting men to engage in healthier or adhere to and believe in and inspire to believe in and really embody more positive aspects of masculinity really have to do with the women in their lives and how they've made possible and made it reasonable to actually aspire to have those kind of ideals that are more holistic and more pro-social, if you will. So I never assumed, and I actually think, I assumed the opposite, that we were talking about spaces where women are definitely part of that conversation, and that has to be part of that conversation. Otherwise, this is not going to work.
Thank you.
So I'll just add on two fronts. One is about the coalition building. So in the state of Connecticut, one of the first things I did when I arrived was to establish a multi-sector alliance for health equity for boys and men of color. Having leaders around the table who are from transportation, who are in the C-suite, those who are working in criminal justice, education, across the spectrum, because we knew we needed to align solutions if we're going to have better collective impact. So I think the coalition piece, and I'm happy to see you here, is really important for us to be thinking about. And then the only other thing I'll add, because I'm sure my colleagues have something to say, is about the trauma-informed approaches. So I'm a trauma psychologist, and one of the things that I've been pushing for, along with other really thoughtful people, is a shift away, not just focusing on trauma-informed, but healing-centered. Because I think that one of the things that we've been recognizing in the community spaces that we're building for conversation is that men don't come to conversations about trauma readily. They will come, maybe, if you talk about their healing or the possibility for an alternative outcome. And we're creating intergenerational spaces. And we've moved away from safe spaces because we don't think boys and men necessarily always need safe spaces. They sometimes need brave spaces. So we have an initiative called Brave New Spaces where we bring youth and elders together to talk about trauma, both racial trauma and also trauma that is inflicted in the course of other life events like community violence. And what we've learned from those conversations is that men and boys have I believe this because I love men and boys. I don't think you should serve a community that you don't love. But I also believe in the capacities of the men and boys to problem solve and to derive grassroots solutions. So we've been using those conversations as ways to drive our policy action, connecting back to what Sana was saying.
Thanks. Randy, do you want to make any comment or respond to any of the questions that were offered here? It's okay if you don't.
Yeah, I think I...
Oh, thanks.
So I actually rather listen to all of you experts. Yes.
Okay, thank you. This is a really useful quality for men, I've heard. Yeah.
Gary, if I might, excuse me, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to add one more question coming from the folks watching online. So we have a question just to add to the mix from Dr. Charles Rogers from the University of Utah School of Medicine. And the question is just, do you feel that the narrow norms of masculinity push men towards risk-taking, unhealthy behaviors, and lack of help-seeking? So just another one to throw into the mix, but wanted to give those tuning in a chance to ask questions.
Okay.
Thank you
for that. Why don't we just go the order here, any response you want to do to any of the questions and any final wrap-up. We've got just a few minutes, and we want to give people time to mingle.
So speaking to the first three questions, one is my young men's clinic. It's actually part of a Title X funded family planning program. And it's one of the unique spaces that Title X has always engaged men in their services, but has made a purposeful intention to increase the use of those services by men over the last 2 decades. And in that context, we've had better questions. We've figured out how to incorporate them better and how young women and women in general in that space, as well as the clinicians, embrace seeing young men. And so that's a sort of co-ed space. From a coalition and partnerships question, Dennis Barber, who was sitting in the second row, but Randy and I and Michael are part of the Partnership for Male Youth, and that's sort of trying to build a coalition around policies and sort of the health of adolescent and young adult males across the board. And so we are a relatively new sort of organization and trying to build, but the purpose is to be broad-based because it's the only way that we can make a difference is for all of us to work together. The third about how we use the best parts of masculinity and sort of incorporate it. There was at least one group, I think it was the Men Who Stop Rape, did this brilliantly and said it's men's strength not to rape. it's men's strength not to hurt. And I think the more we can figure out how to capture on the positive aspects of masculinity, the better.
On the issue of men working with women and vice versa, there is we have quite a bit of experience in bringing women in. Just recently we brought women activists in the Me Too movement to sit down with a group of men from our organization and just talk. And it was an extraordinary interchange. Filled with, frankly, from the women, a lot of misunderstandings about what men are capable of and what they value, and that they don't want to be perceived as harmful or as toxic. And that conversation between men and women has to occur for it to be overall effective. My own bias is that I'd love to see a national program on compassion, because if we had a program to promote compassion like we did to promote the end of littering, it brings into the conversation empathy, understanding, the confrontation of suffering, and the willingness to do something about it.
I just want to add, building on that, I mean, I think across the country right now, we're facing this moment of opportunity in our shared desire for belonging and connectedness, and understanding that individual social isolation is really, really harmful. And I think that shared basis allows us a lot of different opportunities to build coalition and to be in partnership with others and to maybe approach it in a really broad way. So to look for those unexpected partners and stakeholders and approach them and share with them the work that we're doing together, and identify, where we have shared goals and where we're going to be stronger together.
So on the subject of sort of this gendered re-education framework of separation, I really believe that when it comes to younger children who haven't really been socialized, it's a much different framework to operate in, right? When you're dealing with individuals who are, over the age of 10 in their 30s and 40s and 50s, I mean, if I wanted to open up a space for men in their 40s to talk about sexual trauma from their youth perpetrated by a man, I wouldn't recommend having women there. Because if they're just starting to get to a place where they can break down these walls and open up, just doing it in front of men is hard enough, right? So I think we need to look at the norms that have been put on men and see that cutting off their emotions and treating women as the enemy has been a part of our programming. So, my recommendation is let's give men the opportunity to learn these tools just amongst men to start. Let's grid them up. Let's make sure they have the support. And once they get to a place, then we can open it up for that collaboration of women. And by the way, my recommendation goes towards women as well. I think if you look at the Me Too movement didn't have a space for men to really participate for the first wave of it. It was just created as a space, and rightfully so, because men were the ones perpetrating these actions against women. So it was a space for women to be supported by women and to open up and to heal. And then once we had this sort of beautiful framework in place, just now men are starting to come into that space and contribute. So I do agree. I think that we need to be bringing people together, but I think at the same time, initially for the first 1, 2, 3 steps, keeping it separate.
Yeah, that question seems to be the one that we're all riveting on, isn't it? As I said, I think that we are in a time in history that's being driven by the women's movement and the push for gender equality. We are in a collaborative discourse. That is happening. What we know about children in elementary school is that they are together but separate, and that most boys form their intimate relationships first with other boys. That happens by grade 1, is what we know from research. So I think it is a both and. I think we have to recognize and trust that boys together, particularly I think if there's the right kind of conditions, will find a way to hold on to their hearts and their natural empathic connections. But I also think we have to be held accountable, and there has to be some framework to keep our feet to the fires of gender equality, because that's what's driving, I think, this disruption.
Thank you. Want to wrap up, but before we do, first I want to thank the Promundo team, particularly our communications team, Alexa, who you've seen and probably been on email throughout, our communications director, our research team that put out this amazing study. Ruti is our research director who's here, and Cody, one of the co-authors. Brian may be online, but led a lot of the research production there. And the rest of the Promundo team, can I just ask you to hold up your hands? Board members count too, and our admin team and everybody. Just wanted to thank the Promundo team for the work on this. Thanks to the APA space and those who made that possible. And just a few, there's no way to sum all this up, I guess just a few things I wanted to say. Certainly, we as an organization, Promundo, working on healthy masculinities and gender equality, put those two phrases together because for us, there's no way to do this work on masculinities without remembering that we were born out of a relational perspective and a feminist perspective. This is all, we have to be careful that we're not reinforcing the binary as we talk about this work. We are about making, at the end of the day, these qualities that we're sometimes calling masculine and feminine, to make them ultimately in what they are as human qualities. And so, while as we look at our clinical practice and our educational practice, to keep in mind that really is the goal, is that we're trying to strip down these norms that keep us from being the full-hearted humans that all of us are trying to be. I think another piece that was emphasized again and again, and I think wisdom for bringing that up in all of you, of just breaking out of the narrative and a too easy to fall into deficit perspective on this, and finding and I think Farhood, you also brought up, of just finding the richness and wealth of knowledge. I have a 21-year-old daughter who will remind me every day just how much those of us who are older than 21 don't have the knowledge that she brings into the world. And I think being mindful and respectful and empowered by that, not threatened by it, is really clear. And Randy, I may cry on one thing that you said, if I could hold myself together. The just another day hit me really hard, because I think it was that indifference in my high school, it was that indifference about you, of just the violence that passes in boys' and girls' lives, that goes by every single day as just another day, needs to be screamed about, noise made about, and I thank you for bringing that up. And I do hope that we go out of this taking that message. It is unconscionable to think that that is just another day for our sons and daughters, and I thank you for bringing it up, and all of you who have called this. Derek, you brought up deaths by despair. I love that. I don't want to say love that. That is the right-on expression to call what early male mortality is about. And I also was kind of quickly in my notes flipped it around and said, how do we turn those into lives of hope? So thank you for bringing that up, and thanks for talking about that. And thank all of you for being part of this. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Just been poignant every time I've talked to him. It's good.
Yeah.
I'm glad we can figure out how to capture it.
Yeah.
And maybe more.
Yeah, maybe more.